Welcome everyone to our another UK Alumni Engineering webinar. We're happy to have everyone on board with us. I want to give you a couple of updates before we get to the best part of this webinar. This last few weeks we asked you all as alumni to give to a scholarship campaign that brought new students to campus even in the midst of what our country's going through. And we're proud to say you all have raised $426,000 to bring new students to campus. So we're very appreciative. The recruiting team is still working hard. They're working with parents and students to make sure everyone feels very safe about coming back to campus in the fall. So I had to spend some time just thanking you for that. I'm Jana Kennelly. I'm the head of UK Engineering Philanthropy and Alumni, and we're happy to bring you today's webinar. Before we get to our best part, another point I want to make sure you know, just a little bit of housekeeping. Down at chat, you can chat with other audience members, ask questions, talk to each other. That's where you get to talk with other audience members. If you want to ask Rebecca a question about anything that she has to present, we ask you to do that one of two ways. You can write your question in Q&A, and you'll see that at the bottom of your screen. Or you can raise your hand, and when you raise your hand, we'll unmute you, and you'll be able to ask Rebecca verbally your question, and she'll be able to answer it. So that's how we're going to get started. Now, to introduce our favorite flight director, in July 2018, Rebecca Wingfield was named one of 6 women and men selected to join the elite corps flight directors to lead mission control for a variety of operations at NASA's Johnson Space Center. How rare of this is this? While there have been over 350 astronauts, there has only been 100 flight directors in NASA's history. And so we're very proud of what Rebecca has accomplished. From Princeton, Kentucky, and we have to say the daughter of Doug and Joanne Johnson, who are on this webinar today. We're proud that they've joined us as well. Rebecca began by interning at NASA Space Center in Houston after graduating in 2007 with a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering. She joined the flight control team at Johnson Space Center in 2007 as a contractor with United Space Alliance, overseeing maintenance tasks that the astronauts perform in space. Rebecca went on to become a Capcom speaker to the crew on behalf of the control team and a chief training officer, preparing space station crews for their missions. Although mission control comprises numerous units dedicated to the astronauts' safety and the success of each mission, Wingfield's role as flight director puts her in charge of all of them. So we know now if we make it to Mars one day, it very well will be Rebecca who oversees the landmark mission. And as her being a UK alum, we are some of her biggest fans. And so with that, I am turning it over to Rebecca to take it from here.
Thank you so much, Jana. That was a great intro. Let me start sharing my screen here and we'll get started. Thank you for having me here today, you guys. It's really a pleasure to be joining you today and to give you a little insight into what my life is like at NASA as a flight director. I've got just a couple of slides to go through to give you some more background and build on what Janet said in the intro, and then we'll have some time for Q&A, which is usually the most fun. So my name is Rebecca Wingfield. I am a University of Kentucky graduate in mechanical engineering from 2007. Right after I graduated, I moved to Houston, Texas to start working for NASA. And so I really wanted to share this quote with you guys from Michael Collins. You'll know him as the command module pilot from the historic Apollo 11 lunar landing back in 1969. So it really rings true to me that exploration is not a choice, it's what we do as humans. So as Jana mentioned, I was selected into the flight director office in 2018. This is the class that I was selected with, excuse me, pictured here in one of our mission control rooms in Houston, Texas at the Johnson Space Center. So it was a really great class to get selected with. Our backgrounds are diverse, and we've been told that we add some really great qualities to the flight director office. So flight directors in general, what do we do? So within mission control, that's probably the part that you see the most. You can correlate it to if you've seen the movie Apollo 13. Gene Kranz is the one with the white vest and the crew cut. That's what I do. So Gene Kranz was white flight. Our very first flight director was Chris Kraft back in 1960, and then shortly followed by Gene, John Hodge, and Glenn Lunny. And they selected colors to designate their team name so that when they went on console, which is what we call being in the room in mission control, when they went on console, they had their team with them. So Dr. Kraft was red flight, and he led the red team. Gene Kranz, you always see him in a white vest because he was white flight, and he led the white team there in mission control. So here's just a couple of pictures. Down in the far right was my very first solo shift as a flight director. I'm getting my handover from Jeff Radigan from the previous shift there. So within the flight control room, what we do is risk management. So we govern all of the real-time operations of the spacecraft. In my instance, it's the International Space Station, although NASA has a lot of programs going right now. But for human spaceflight, our main program right now is the International Space Station. So when I go to work, I'm responsible for all of the risk management in the real-time world for the International Space Station. We have to make quick decisions. Our priorities are very clear: keep the crew safe, keep the vehicle safe and running, and then achieve our mission objectives. The International Space Station, which we're going to get to a little bit more in just a minute, is a state-of-the-art laboratory and a really, really exciting place to live and work. So I started out, as Jana mentioned, in Western Kentucky. I grew up in Caldwell County. You see me there with my letter jacket in the top right. I was always enamored with space. I had grandparents that lived down in Florida on the Space Coast, and we got to go out to the Kennedy Space Center quite often. And that's really where the bug bit me, was pretty early on. When I started looking for colleges, I looked all around the country, but obviously settled on the University of Kentucky because it was the best option, of course. My sister was already there, and I knew that I was good at math and science. I thought maybe I would want to build roller coasters, so I started my career as a civil engineer at UK. During my freshman year, I found out that NASA at the Kennedy Space Center was taking co-ops through their cooperative education program, but only for mechanical engineers. So I went and changed my major immediately so that I could apply for the co-op program. And so from there, I was selected into the co-op program for the Kennedy Space Center, and I did 4 tours, which led me to graduate in 5 years, but I wasn't mad at it. I got some really great work experience through the co-op program. So here's a couple of pictures. In the top left, we're in the white room that was leading into Space Shuttle Discovery with a bunch of co-ops. I had so many great experiences in that. I worked in a design office for flight support equipment. So that means we got to get outside and work on the launch pad and work on the crawler and really get our hands dirty in all of the nitty-gritty engineering details for what we were doing at that time for shuttle, and how we were processing equipment to be flown on the shuttle for the space station. So that was a really, really cool time for me to be in the co-op program. When I graduated, as Jana mentioned, I started my career at the Johnson Space Center in 2007. On June 4th, actually, I just passed my work anniversary, as we call it. So June 4th, I started in 2007 as an operations support officer for the International Space Station. So if we go back to our Apollo 13, the movie example, the OSOs, which is what we were, operations support officer, the OSOs are the ones that take all of the piece parts when something goes wrong and help the astronauts build instructions for how to fix it. So in Apollo 13, they needed a CO2 scrubber, so they got, you know, a box and a filter and a sock, and had to figure out how they could remove carbon dioxide from their living cabin environment. It's very similar to what we as an OSO did on the International Space Station. And in fact, I did a lot of work on our carbon dioxide removal assembly and our regenerative ECLA system, which is what the International Space Station uses to take what one of my astronaut friends calls today's coffee and recycle it into tomorrow's coffee. So that whole cycle, water cycle that you have to reduce down into a couple of machines so that you have fresh drinking water on the space station. So I was in OSO for a long time. I loved my job there. It was very mechanical and hands-on, and I got it, and it was really great. When I was in OSO, I was selected as a CAPCOM. That's a picture of me in the top left. The CAPCOM, or the Capsule Communicator, is a job that was originally reserved for astronauts, so that the astronauts up in space would have a friendly voice that they knew, that they could trust down on the Earth, that would give them the information from the mission control team. In that picture, I'm with astronaut Serena Anand-Chancellor, who spent 6 months in space about a year ago now. She's back home here on planet Earth, but we were working the cargo mission together for SpaceX 4, I think, as cargo was being delivered to the International Space Station. So that was a fun day for me. On the right, the picture there, we often get good visitors that come through mission control, really interesting people that we can meet. Very often, if somebody's doing a concert in Houston, they'll come down and want to tour mission control, that kind of thing. I used to always complain that nobody cool ever came through mission control when I was there, until this day when the president came through it. Now I can't complain anymore, because that's pretty much the most amazing thing that could have happened. So that was a really cool day to be a CAPCOM there in mission control. So like Jana said, in 2018, I was selected as flight director. We went through some pretty rigorous training to get our certification so that we could sit in mission control and do the risk management and run the team from that aspect. We also do a lot of work off of console, so while we do staff a team 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, obviously it's not always just me. We have a whole team of flight directors and a whole team of flight controllers that's there and trade out. When I'm not there in mission control, I'm often prepping for other missions that are coming up. We do a lot of looking at lessons learned from past missions, and also a lot of the integration of all of the technical aspects of things that are going on the International Space Station. So at the end of my training, that very first shift that I got to take, you saw a picture of me earlier when I got to take the shift from Jeff Radigan, you get to announce a team name. So I chose cerulean. It is a color which is traditional. As I mentioned, Dr. Kraft started the tradition as red flight. It was really important to me to pick a color, although, as you know, we have 97 flight directors now, so a lot of the colors were already taken. And in fact, some folks have gone on to pick celestial bodies or characteristics that really embody our foundations of flight control. We have things like Mercury and Galileo and Viking flight. But cerulean was important to me for 3 reasons. It's a small town in Western Kentucky, which I really like. It also happens to be the color blue, which was important to me. And it's the color of the horizon line that you can see from space, the curvature of space, that horizon line. And the root word is the Latin word for heaven, which I thought was really impactful for me personally. So I am cerulean flight, number 92 in the history of flight directors. And this is the beautiful spaceship that I get to work on. So this is the International Space Station. I know I'm going pretty fast, so we'll definitely do a Q&A after this, but this is the International Space Station. And I've got some facts here, but if you can imagine that a football field is overlaying sort of the rectangle that is made by the arrays there, that'll give you some context of how big it is. So the end zone, the back of each end zone, and then the sidelines make that rectangle from the solar arrays there. That's how big the International Space Station is. It's basically a 6-bedroom, 2-bathroom house One of the biggest differences that you don't have to think in square feet, you think in cubed feet, because you get to use the ceiling and the walls and everything. You can walk on any of them and float around and store things overhead in the deck, wherever it will fit. So that space station is currently orbiting the Earth 250 miles up from sea level, and it goes around the Earth every 90 minutes. So the astronauts, we have 5 aboard right now that see 16 sunrises and sunsets a day. So they go around every 90 minutes. This year, in 2020, we will mark 20 years of continuous occupancy on the International Space Station. This slide is a little bit old. I have 18 years there, but this year is 20 years for space station. So that's a pretty cool aspect there. We have a gym that includes a treadmill and a bike and a resistive exercise device, because bone loss is one of our major issues for long duration missions for the astronauts. We keep it at what we call shirt sleeve comfort level. So it's at 1 atmosphere pressure and around 72 degrees and pretty dry, not too humid, to the comfort level of the crew, but also all of the electronics and experiments that are on board. We have a closed loop water reclamation system, which we talked about earlier, and the space station operates on Greenwich Mean Time, which is a maritime standard, also known as UTC, that we operate off of, and it is designated as a U.S. national laboratory. So when I'm working in mission control, one of the really cool, actually not just when I'm working mission control, also when we're prepping for missions, one of the most fun aspects of my job is the diversity in who I get to work with. So we have international partners from Russia and Japan and Europe, several countries within Europe. We also have commercial partners with Northrop Grumman and SpaceX. You all probably are most familiar with this recent SpaceX launch where we put 2 astronauts on one of their vehicles for the first time, which was a really cool thing to be able to work on. And so to think just in general about how often I get to cross lines with these international partners and really collaborate for the greater good of mankind and what experiments we have going on board, it's a really, really cool thing to see. So I talked a little bit earlier about how I work for the International Space Station, which is true, but NASA in general has a lot going on for human spaceflight. So we've got cargo missions that are commercially provided from SpaceX and Northrop Grumman. We also have cargo resupply missions that are sponsored by our Japanese counterpart. Sierra Nevada Corporation in Colorado will come online probably in the next year or so as a cargo flight to resupply the International Space Station. We also have commercial crew providers in Boeing and SpaceX. So that's the program that you saw recently with what we call Demo 2, Demonstration Mission Number 2, that delivered Doug Hurley and Bob Behnken up to the International Space Station, was on a SpaceX crew mission. And then we're also looking forward to the moon and onto Mars. So we currently have folks working on the Orion capsule, as well as the Space Launch System, the SLS, big giant rocket that they're building down at the Kennedy Space Center that will take our astronauts forward to the moon, and in a sustainable way, where we're building a gateway, sort of like a mini space station that will stay in orbit around the moon. So all of those things are very exciting, and it makes the next several years of my career outlook very exciting to look into. So I think this might be the last or second to last slide that I have, but these are some pictures of me in action in one of the mission control rooms there at Johnson Space Center. So I've talked a couple of times about the demonstration mission number 2 from SpaceX that recently launched. We put a Dragon capsule on top of a Falcon 9 rocket, both built by the SpaceX Corporation in Hawthorne, California, and they launched from our historic Pad 39 at the Kennedy Space Center. And after launch, when everything settled down and the crew was ready to go to sleep, I got to take over mission control, right? Because like I said, we have flight directors there 365 days a year, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So we did 3 shifts. So our flight lead took the launch shift. And then after the launch shift was complete, I took over. Then we had another guy take over for the overnight shift there in Houston. Our launch lead took back over for docking. And then I got to take over after docking to see those guys were safely in the space station, and we put them to bed after a very long couple of days. And I have been on a couple of times for space station shifts recently where Doug and Bob are living and working and thriving on the International Space Station. So it's really good to see them be reunited with Chris Cassidy and Anatoly Ivanishyn and Ivan Wagner, who were already up there on the space station. They arrived on a Soyuz rocket. So it's really cool to see all 5 of those guys in space living and working together. So this definitely is my last slide. There's just a couple of references if you guys wanted to see them. If you've never seen the space station fly over, like I said, it's only 250 miles up. That Spot the Station website is really, really good. So you can go there and put your zip code in, and you can actually sign up for receiving text messages. Well, they will tell you when the space station's going to fly over your town and where to look, if it's northwest or southeast, however it's going to fly over, and at what inclination to look for it. And believe me, you will not miss it. If you've never seen it, you will not miss it if you're looking in the right spot. It is the brightest star in the sky, and it's moving real fast, 17,500 miles an hour. So you'll see it. Several of my fellow flight directors wrote a book a couple of years ago called Operating an Outpost in the New Frontier. And it is free to download if you'd like to read that. That's all about mission control and how we operate the International Space Station. And then, of course, a smattering of other social media things you can follow. And I really recommend Houston. We have a podcast if you'd like to learn some more about what we do at the Johnson Space Center and all of the people that are there to really utilize your tax dollars and fly people to space. So that's all I have, and it's, again, thank you for letting me do this for you guys today and be a part of this. I really love engaging with my fellow UK folks. You guys are my people. I say that all the time, and if you're ever in Houston, I would love to give you a tour when we get back to that sort of normal type of thing. So Jana, I think we're back to you.
Yeah, so Rebecca, we have questions for you. So
okay.
I'm gonna, again, I'll remind the audience that you can put a question in Q&A or raise your hand. So let's start with the first one. So great job, Rebecca, is what Anatoly says. You started your career path to flight director early, taking the right steps and getting tapped to take big strides while at NASA. There says amazing. The question, though, is it realistic to think that a mid-career person in engineering can start a path to flight director and make it there? If so, how do flight directors typically get there?
Okay, that's a great question. The answer that I'll say is yes. I think that it's a thing that you could pursue. Absolutely. The openings only go out every once in a while. It's not on a regular basis, so you'll have to kind of keep your ear to the ground for when that's available. I'm actually not sure when the next one will be. I think we had talked about doing it this fall, but I don't know if that's been moved out because of all of the COVID and distributed ops kind of things. Hi, Doug Overholtz. I see you put that in the. I haven't actually said hi to my mom and dad either, so hi.
Oh yeah, you better do that.
As far as, sorry, going back to the question, as far as mid-career moves, that is absolutely possible. So if you look at the picture of the 6 of us that were selected in my class, 5 of us were working at NASA's Johnson Space Center, have built our careers as flight controllers at NASA for the International Space Station. But Paul Kanya actually came to us as a retired Air Force officer. So he's had a whole career through the Air Force that he worked through. He actually launched rockets on the Air Force side at the Kennedy Space Center, so he wasn't too far away. But that is not unheard of. We've had folks come across that are not born and bred NASA folks that have become flight directors. So the thing is just to remember to keep your ear out for when the openings become available and put your resume in and see where it goes.
Okay, now we're going to have, I believe Jessica and Kate Hastings are listening. And so we are going to unmute them so that they can talk to us. There's Kate.
Hi.
Kate, I think you're on mute. So there we go.
Hi. I just wanted to ask, when you were at Capcom, what do you think was the most interesting thing that you ever watched happen on the ISS?
Oh, that is a great question. A lot of things. So I always tell people, even though I love my job as a flight director, because I really enjoy being in charge, you can ask my parents that, I really do enjoy being in charge. Being a Capcom is the most fun job in the flight control room because you get to watch everybody else doing their very technical job, and you take all of that information and you get to kind of turn it into regular people words and give it up to the astronauts. So it's really just funneling communication, and it's really, really enjoyable to watch all of these technical aspects and pieces come together as the flight director weighs the risk management for the operations team as well as for the astronauts and get it up. I would say the most interesting thing that I got to observe as a Capcom is probably a spacewalk. So being there as the crew gets suited up to go do a spacewalk, we put them in the airlock and we take all of the air out of the room, quite literally, and then we let them go outside and do some maintenance tasks and do upgrades to the International Space Station. And it is one of the most dangerous things that we do or that we put the astronauts into. And to be a part of that team and be a part of the success of the astronauts being able to come back in and safely and take their spacesuits off, that's really a rewarding day. I would also say that coming from a background of the operations support officer, where I did a lot of maintenance in my past, always doing maintenance on the space station is one of my favorite things to do. So anytime we get to fix the carbon dioxide removal assembly or fix the potty, that kind of stuff, that's really what I love to do.
Kate, do you have any more questions?
I think that's all for now.
All right.
Thank you.
Kate. All right, another one from Cameron Farley. Cameron says, when things are operating nominally, what would a normal shift consist of?
That's a great question, and it really depends on which shift you're on. So we do sort of orbit 1, orbit 2, orbit 3. That's the terminology that we use. So orbit 1 comes on shift about an hour and a half before the crew wakes up, but it's in the middle of the night in Houston. So during that shift, we get to do a lot of the execution of the crew day from when they wake up until about their lunchtime. But it's an interesting dynamic because there's not a whole lot of other people around in the office and that kind of stuff. So you're really, really focused on the execution of the crew day. And then the orbit 2 shift gets basically from the crew lunch into when we sign off for the evening and they get to go do whatever they want to do in the evening, eat their dinner and that kind of stuff. And that one is a little bit busier because you start hearing about what are we going to be doing the next couple of days with all of the people that are in the office and working on different projects. And then we have the orbit 3 shift, which is while the crew is asleep, and we call that our planning shift. So that's the shift that gets to take all of these inputs from around the world and figure out what our priorities are. And it is a lot of paperwork, but it also is really fun to see a timeline develop and how you're going to, not just what the crew is doing for the next couple of days, but that's also very often when the robotic arm is out and doing its motions. So you may be, while you're doing all of this paperwork to get ready for the next couple of days for the crew, you are also monitoring and helping with risk management with the robotic arm as they're maybe moving giant batteries from one side to the other or getting set up for an EVA, that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of things that happen while the crew's asleep that we tell them about, they know about because it's their house and their home, but they're not directly involved with. So that's kind of the flavors of all 3 shifts that we have on the station.
That's amazing. So another question is Ginger Strucker, if I say this right, first question is, did you work on the recent SpaceX launch and how?
Yeah, so after being certified as a flight director, one of the first things that I got put on as a project was the SpaceX Demo 2 mission. So I got to take several trips out to Hawthorne, California, and be a part of their flight control team as they are learning and figuring out how they are going to do operations for their capsule. So that was a really enjoyable time. And then, like I mentioned, when it came to the actual launch and operations, I came on right after launch. So after the whole launch process and all the flashbang and fireworks that everybody loves to see, after everything quieted down, then I got to take over the ship. So that was a pretty cool thing for me to do. But it's also very nice to see all of the people that I got to work with out in Hawthorne, California, really live out what we had been practicing. So all of the simulations that we have been doing, all of the rules that we had written about how the flight was going to go, and to see that in action was really, really fun.
Wow. Ginger also asked, what experiments are done on the space station?
So many, so many. And if you go on nasa.gov, you can go, and they have a really great website about all of the different experiments that are currently running, ones that have run in the past, that have had papers written about them. So there's some really great information out there for all of the things that are going on. One thing that I like to mention is just having crew members live and work in space for an extended period of time is an experiment in itself. So Christina Cook, who just came back a couple of months ago, maybe in November last year, was up there for almost a year. So looking at how microgravity in low Earth orbit has affected her body, and all of the things that she took samples of, blood samples and saliva samples while she was on board, as well as before she flew. And now after being home and being able to measure her bone density and what her muscles have done, how she's able to exercise and that kind of stuff, is one of the main experiments that we do just by having crew live and work on board. But there's a lot going on. We do a lot of pharmaceutical research. The crew also has been involved in growing vegetables on board. We've had several veggie experiments, which is kind of cool to watch. Some of them have been flowers, but we've also grown lettuce, which they then were able to harvest and eat, which is sort of a treat for them because they don't get a whole lot of fresh food. But there's a lot going on the space station.
That's tremendous. So Christy asked, would you ever want to go to space as an astronaut?
I always tell people that I'm the kid that never grew out of the I want to be an astronaut phase of life. I would go in a heartbeat if they would put me on a rocket, I would go for sure. Let's do it.
Okay. I love it. Ginger is someone who works in the propulsion field and also from Western Kentucky. She's from Mayfield. She would love a tour someday, and I'm sure the audience is curious. What is the best way to set that up when time comes and everyone can travel again?
Sure thing. So we do have Space Center Houston that is available if you ever are down in Houston, Texas. That's our visitor center that you can go to. They've got lots of things set up and have some really great tours available. But if you are just down there and would like a single tour, you can contact me. And I think, Jana, you guys probably have my contact info. So if anybody's interested, we could do that. I have no idea when things will open up again. So don't hold that against me.
I think that's perfect. Ethan Huber wants to know, what is the most fun of being a flight director? Great question.
That is a great question. For me, it's being a part of a team that I can see grow and do different things and really achieve goals, which is ultimately rewarding to see people of different walks of life come together on very technical and sometimes really hard subjects and figure out how to solve a problem and then to put it into action and see it actually come to fruition in space is so rewarding to be a part of that team.
Yeah, that sounds. Another anonymous attendee said, I'm about to begin my sophomore year studying space systems, engineering, and astrophysics. I bet they know Dr. Smith. After graduation, I would love to work for NASA. What steps could I take to help reach my dream of working at NASA especially JPL.
Okay, go talk to Ilka. Get placed in the co-op program and work or as an intern. NASA has a really good Pathways internship program for all of the centers. I got lucky and got at the Kennedy Space Center, and then was hired on actually as a contractor at the Johnson Space Center after I graduated. But getting that experience during your collegiate career is the best props that you can get as you're trying to get hired on. So go talk to Ilka, get placed in a co-op or internship program. That's my advice.
That's awesome. Way to go. Ilka's clapping, I'm sure, right? Covetta Ramey, if I'm saying that right, said, "Hi, Becca. We're so proud of you."
It's Covita. Hi.
Oh, Covita. Nice. Thank you. How do flight directors manage the adrenaline rush and the emotional highs and lows that come along with the job responsibilities of being a flight director?
That's a really great question. It's also how we select all of our flight controllers. You don't really know how somebody is going to react until you get into a situation that is full of adrenaline. One thing that we do is we stress ourselves as flight directors as well as our controllers in a lot of simulations. So we have a really great simulator for the International Space Station that we have a whole team of instructors that know how to break it and make bad things happen in the simulator so that we can practice how we recover. And we do a lot of throwing everything but the kitchen sink kind of stuff at people. So you get that stress feeling and you understand, how am I going to come up from this mountain of bad things that are happening so that I can keep the crew safe, keep the vehicle running, and then achieve our mission objectives. And we talk about those three things in priority order all of the time. We talk about them very, very deliberately so that we know that we are making every decision based on the safety of the crew, the viability of the vehicle, and then our mission objectives. And we, after our simulations, will go through a debrief process where we just sit and talk about what happened during that simulation. What could we have done better? What did you need from your teammates that you didn't get? What could you have pushed out to your other teammates to help us address a certain situation differently? So we stress each other and we learn from each other, and that's really how we get prepared for bad days in space.
So, and the next question is from Bernadette DuPont, and I'm going to put this together. When you remove air from the room, you then have to add air back into the room. How is the air generated, replaced?
Sure, that's a great question. So I think she's referencing when we go do an EVA, right? We send the crew into an airlock and they have their own personalized spacesuit on that has an air system in it, has an oxygen bottle that gives them air for when they're going out in space. So we put them into the airlock and we close the door, and we have a pump that actually pumps all of the air into that volume, well, most of the air, back into the space station so we can save it. So we don't want to just vent it overboard and lose it. So we pump it back into the space station so we can save most of it. And then the very last little bit that the pump isn't efficient for goes overboard. And so after that, the crew goes out and does their spacewalk, and then they come back in. And when they're ready to come back inside, we open a valve and put the air back into that little room so that it's then at the same pressure as the rest of the space station. So that's how we do that particular process. And then the other part of your question is, how do we make breathing air for the crew? So like I said, we keep the space station at 14.7 PSI. It has basically the same makeup as we have here on Earth with nitrogen and oxygen and some other minor constituents that are in the air. We generate oxygen through a system that is very similar to what is used on submarines. So we take water in and we split it into hydrogen and oxygen, and we put the oxygen into the cabin. Right now, we've bent the hydrogen overboard. We have had in the past and will in the future have another system called Sabatier that will then take that hydrogen and combine it with CO2 and make it back into water. So we try really hard to have a closed loop system as much as possible. We don't want to lose anything overboard. Sometimes you have to, but to make oxygen, we split water apart.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Christine Hankins says, how can I get to go into space?
So you just missed one chance. They just closed astronaut applications, I think about a month ago. But you can apply to be an astronaut for NASA, but there are also companies that are starting up that are now looking at private astronaut missions. So I have no idea how much they cost. I'm sure they're more than I will ever make, but you can take a look at that and see if there's a way for you to privately launch into space. Corporations like Virgin Galactic and SpaceX, I know, are looking into those things. Although that's not part of my direct job, so I don't know a whole lot about it, but always look to when the NASA astronaut applications are open and put that resume in. You never know what's going to happen.
I love it. Sujit Sinha is on the call. And what prep work or effort do you have to perform when not on console? For example, reviewing crew activity plan in advance of your shift?
Sure, that's a really great question. So one thing that I'm working on right now is, right now the space station is in what we call Expedition 63. So we've demarcated specific time periods for when specific astronaut crews are going to be on board, and those are their expeditions. So right now is Expedition 63. So one of the projects that I'm working on is the planning for Expedition 64, which will start in September, October timeframe.
Okay.
I can't remember exactly when that is, but so right now we're putting together, what EVAs are we going to do? What things do we need to do to the space station in order to get ready or to make things better, to do maintenance activities if we need to do that? What experiments are coming up during that time period on cargo flights so that we can be ready to execute those once everything arrives? And then just all of the different things, if you can imagine packing and being ready for an orbital outpost that you'll leave for in about 6 months, and all of the preparations that go into that. And then we also very often take a look at what is actually continuously, what's going on the space station, and what we have flight rules around how we operate. So are those flight rules still telling us what the safest possible option is for the crew? And do we need to reevaluate things as the space station ages? And how do we make sure that we're optimizing the time for the crew, but also to make sure that we're getting everything out of every experiment that we need, that the principal investigators are getting the answers that they need from their experiments? And how do we make all of that stuff work in concert?
Another good question is, God, there's so many. This is awesome. You're quite popular. So for the benefit of the students on the call, would you be willing to share your hardest or worst day on the job?
Yeah. So I will start by saying that human spaceflight at NASA is run by humans, which means that mistakes are going to get made, and it just is part of who we are. But we really, really talk a lot about how you recover from those mistakes, and that's really how we want to execute the mission. So not to say that it's okay to make a mistake, because you never really want to, but it's more about how do you recover, how do you get the team back into a position where they can go through. So probably the worst mistake that I ever made was, as an operations support officer, I had written a procedure for the crew to clean a fan, which doesn't sound that intimidating, but there's a lot that goes into it. You have to take out, if you can imagine trying to get to your air conditioning system that may be buried inside of a wall somewhere, and you've got to take off panels and get to it and get the vacuum cleaner out and that kind of stuff. What I did was I sent the crew to the wrong location in the procedure. So they went to go clean a fan, and there was a fan in that location, but it was still running. And so the fan was still running, and that was my fault. We had safed the fan that we wanted them to clean, and it was ready to be done. But the crew got over there. Luckily, they called down and said, "Hey, are you sure this is what you want me to do? The fan blades are still spinning. I don't think I need to stick my hand down in there." So that was a bad day for me. Luckily, it all ended up pretty safe, and the crew is a good double check for things that are in their working environment, right? It's in their house and how they're going to operate their life. So we got them redirected back to where we were supposed to do, and you just got to kind of get back on your horse and start riding again. and know that everything needs to be, you have to be very vigilant about what you're doing, especially when it comes to the safety of somebody else.
Yeah, good point. Well, on another note, of all your jobs at NASA, which one has been your favorite?
I'm pretty partial to flight director right now. I love doing it. I've been doing it almost 2 years. I just passed the point where I've been certified for a year. So that means that I've been sitting in mission control working shifts for about a year now. And it is a ton of fun. Whether you're on that Orbit 3 planning shift on a Friday night when nobody else is around, or you're in the nitty gritty with the crew and executing things, it just, to be able to work in an environment where I get to see these camera views of this glorious planet Earth all day for 9 hours while I'm sitting there, but also get to be on the team that is advancing humans into exploration is just, it's the most fun.
Awesome. Okay, so we have a couple of things kind of as a rising senior in high school with dreams of becoming an astronaut, aerospace engineer. Would it be better to work towards a private pilot license and perhaps go through the Air Force, or would it be better to work towards a master's degree in college?
All are great options. And I'll tell you some advice that I've heard several of the astronauts say, and that is pick what you want to do. Pick what will make you happy, because ultimately you being happy in a career field will make you really good at it. And in order to be selected as an astronaut, don't concentrate so much on how do I become an astronaut. Find something that really resonates with you, that is something that you will enjoy no matter if you get picked or not. And then that way you can really blossom and look for new opportunities, maybe different ways to evolve that career path, different experiences that you can use to then get into the astronaut office. So I wouldn't say that any one of those things is better than the other one. Just pick one, pick something that you will love to do no matter what.
And then you mentioned getting certified or qualified as a flight director. What does that process involve?
Yeah, so after we got selected in June of 2018, we started a pretty rigorous training process. So each of us, as you can imagine, have a pretty varied background and where we came from. Like I mentioned, Paul came to us as a retired Air Force colonel. Some of us had backgrounds in the power systems on space station, the attitude control system on space station, so different things. And so we then all got a training program that really equalized us all and taught us all about all of the systems on the space station, but also taught us a lot about working with international partners, how to work with an interpreter, when interpreters are appropriate, and how to utilize them in a mission operations environment, as also as within meetings. And so a lot of hands-on training for the actual operations of the space station. We also had training on what life as an astronaut is like on the space station. So we got to learn how they fix their food, and how they work out on the treadmill, or how they lift weights, and how they go to the bathroom, and where they sleep, and all of that kind of stuff, because it's important as the owner of risk management in the operational environment, how those astronauts, who are not robots, they're real live human people, and how they're living in space and doing all of the work that we ask them to do, because behavioral health is also a very important aspect, right? They can't just leave work and go home and take a nap. They can't walk outside and get a breath of fresh air. They have to live in the environment where they're working. And so learning about all of the systems on space station, as well as how to operate in that environment, took about a year to get us all through the process and certified.
Wow. Another good, I guess, for our fellow alumni, they asked, do you work with other UK grads at NASA?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's one of my favorite things to see somebody that has a cup or a shirt or a lapel pin, and you can give each other a high five and a go Cats, and it's sort of like a little fun little club that we all join into. I will say that there are several folks around the Johnson Space Center that I know that are UK alums, but one time I was walking out of Mission Control and saw a girl that was wearing a UK shirt. I think it was cold outside. It might have been like a hoodie or something, and I gave her a high five and a go Cats, and we kind of got to to talking, and she asked where I was from, and I said, oh, small town, Western Kentucky, real close to Paducah. And she said, oh, me too. And I was like, okay. And she said, what is it? And I was like, it's Princeton. You've probably never heard of it. And she goes, nope, that's where I'm from. And I was like, there's no way. So
Oh,
crazy. So
wow.
she's a little bit younger than me, Abigail Coleman, but I actually graduated high school with her older sister, went all through school with her older sister. So that was a really funny thing. And then, you know, I'm telling my my other flight director class colleagues this story, and they're like, you Kentucky people are so funny.
That's pretty good. That's pretty awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, we still have a few more questions, and we're getting about 9 minutes left, so I wanted to make sure. Are you scheduled as a flight director and consul during any future crew launches? You know that?
Sure. So I've been on console for several Soyuz launches now. That's a fun day to be there to watch all of the operations as our American crews get to ride on the Russian rocket and get them ready for their arrival on the space station. So I've been on console for their launches as well as their dockings to the International Space Station. It's always a good day to see that hatch opening and the crew come into the ISS after a pretty long day on top of that rocket. For the next couple of like SpaceX and Boeing launches, I'm not directly assigned to them, but we'll see what happens. All of the flight directors that are assigned are absolutely qualified, and I'll always be trying to nudge my way into the exciting days, because being on console it beats any day in the office, that's for sure.
Jenny Smith says, because your job is to translate the technical talk to something easily usable for astronauts, how much time do you spend familiarizing yourself with the systems on the space station before you were able to apply? I think you answered this a little bit. How much time do you before unfamiliar tasks happen?
Sure. So when you are selected as a Capcom, you also go through a pretty good training program where even if your background wasn't in some of the systems on the space station, you get a good breadth of training to understand what those systems are and to get the technical content. That's also why majority, I'd say, of the folks that work in mission control are engineers, because you have that background to understand a lot of the technical jargon that goes into how those systems works. We also have folks that are have degrees in mathematics and physics and that kind of thing, but it's all within that same STEM group, right? So that you can understand how all of those systems work and be able to translate that. The astronauts also obviously are very, very smart. They understand how the systems work on the space station. They just often don't have down to the nitty-gritty detail all of the information that the team on the ground has. So it's dividing up that information with all of the little technical details and then helping understand what the crew on board actually needs to know.
Wow. So Ted Iden, he's an electrical engineer grad from 82 and from Plano, or in Plano now. He says, congrats on an exciting career. So proud of a fellow Wildcat.
Thank you.
Can you describe the computing power needed for the International Space Station? Yes.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I would say that it really varies. So the main computers that we have that are operating a lot of the routine systems on board the International Space Station, first of all, operate in tiers. So we have like a top tier of computers that runs all of its primary programs, and then we have lower tiers that have all of the remote inputs into them, they feed up. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's sort of how it works, is this tiered structure. So if you think about that space station's been up there for 20 years now, when those computers would have had to have been developed, and also to think that we took a lot of the technology that was being developed for Space Station Freedom at the time, before it became the International Space Station. So our main computers were really developed around the late 70s, early 80s kind of time frame, and we have been upgrading them a little bit as we go along. Now, we also have other systems on board that have their own computing power. So we have, one of the things we have is called the caution and warning system, so emergency caution and warning, and that's what takes signals from all of the different little things that can happen on space station and enunciate alarms for the crew. So those are run actually off of different laptops that are all over the space station that will give a yellow or a red signal whenever something is going awry with some of the equipment. So there's a lot of different piece parts to that question, but the computing power is a lot. There's a lot going on.
Sounds like it. Olive Windroff, if I'm saying that right, says, congrats on your fantastic achievements. How is the handover between your international partners handled?
Okay, that's a great question. So our international partners are also there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So any given shift that I'm working, I can call my Russian counterpart, SRP, in Moscow. I can call my European counterpart, we call him Coal Flight, because they run the Columbus module, Coal Flight. And I can also call J Flight, who is our JAXA counterpart. So they are there all of the time. And anytime a NASA flight director comes on, we have an hour period blocked off where we get information from the team that is going off, and then we get a briefing from our team that's going to be there. So I go around, first of all, I go around the Earth. So I talk to our Payload Operations Center in Huntsville, Alabama, and get a briefing from them. I talk to the European Control Center, and we have a resident NASA person in Russia that gives us a briefing, and also our Japanese counterparts that give us a briefing. Sometimes that briefing could be nothing to add or not anything going on specifically for them, but they are always there so that we can be poised and ready to respond to any kind of emergency or quick event that needs to be addressed.
Great. Sam McNeil has another good question. Great job, Rebecca. And do you work with any ag engineers on the food production or resource recycling systems on the space station?
That's a great question. Hi, Sam. It's good to see your name there. Ag engineers, I don't know specifically if I've ever interacted with an ag engineer. We do have a whole food lab group of people that works on how to source the food and where it's coming from. And there's also a whole group of people in Huntsville, Alabama that, like I said, works on that veggie experiment, that there's a principal investigator that's working on how to grow crops both on the space station and for when we go to the moon, to figure out how we're going to grow crops there. They have these little pillow packets. I think of them as like seed pods that you would get if you're going to start a little garden. These little pillow packets, and the crew has to add water to them, and they have this special pink light that helps the plants grow, and they turn it on and off for solar cycles and that kind of thing. So I know there's a whole group of people that are working that pretty rigorously.
So Christy asked, how did UK engineering help prepare for your position?
No, that's a great question. I loved my time at UK. I wouldn't trade it for the world. Sometimes I think that it would be a lot of fun to go back and do it again. Maybe I would pay a little bit more attention. But I loved my career at UK. Definitely the most impactful part of that, like I mentioned before, was the co-op program, to really get some hands-on understanding of all of the things that we are learning in the classroom, to really be able to apply them in a real-world application. Was very important for me to be able to understand how those things, all of those equations and all of those, heat transfer and all of those things that we were learning in the classroom, how they applied, and how I could apply them in a job. And then I think operations is one of the career fields that you could choose from after being an engineer, and it's really been a great fit for me. I went through my whole career thinking I was going to be a design engineer, which probably would have been equally as fun, but operations is really where it's at for me, for sure.
Well, Rebecca, we're coming up on our time, and we want to thank you for doing this. There's lots of kudos on chat and Q&A. Thanking you.
Thank you.
Very excited about your career. Very proud that you're from Kentucky and are representing us well in the leadership position that you have. Anything else that you would like to say as we end?
No, I just really appreciate the opportunity to do this, Jana. Thanks again for having me and for your team. It was really great, all of the setup and making sure that I understood which buttons to click before we started. So thank you for that, and thanks for asking me. And it's been really great to see some familiar names on the question and answer, as well as my mom and dad. Thanks. They're not engineers, but we won't hold that against them. So I appreciate it. Thank you so much.